Welcome to Left Africa.
So, what if I told you that a country's brand new green tax-like, a policy that's explicitly designed to save the planet and promote environmental responsibility, actually lowered the price of imported luxury vehicles?
I mean, that sounds like a glitch in the system or a typo in the legislation on its own.
You would think so, right? But that is actually the exact reality of the policy we're unpacking today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, let's unpack this. Our goal here is to look right past the pristine, environmental label on this new policy.
Yeah, the marketing of it.
Exactly. To discover the incredibly complex intersection of climate goals, government debt, and social inequality.
That's a tangled web.
It really is. So we should start with the baseline, the official narrative. The Nigerian government recently passed the N68.3 trillion budget of consolidation.
That is a massive, record-breaking budget.
Huge. And nestled inside this budget is this new green tax. The stated purpose is, officially, aligning fiscal policy with climate goals.
Well, on paper, that sounds like textbook modern governance, right?
Yeah.
A government recognizing the looming threat of climate change and adjusting its tax code to encourage greener behavior.
Right, but I was looking at how this is actually applied, and the mechanics seem completely at odds with that goal.
How so?
Well, from what I can tell, they're relying on excise duties and green levies that exclusively target consumption-heavy sectors.
Oh, yeah.
They aren't going after corporate carbon footprints or, taxing accumulated wealth. They are literally just increasing the cost of daily manufactured goods.
Yes.
Am I misreading this, or is this entirely a tax on everyday consumer purchasing?
No, you're reading it entirely correctly. What's fascinating here is how an excise duty actually functions. It's a tax imposed on specific goods produced or sold within a country. So, by structuring the green tax this way, the government ensures that every time a consumer buys a product falling under this umbrella.
Like what kind of products?
Say basic plastics, certain textiles, or packaged goods. They pay a premium to fund the state's green initiatives.
And that introduces a glaring paradox that the briefing highlights. Because in the very same fiscal package that raises consumption taxes on basic goods, the government is cutting tariffs on selected imports.
And specifically vehicles, right?
Yes, specifically vehicles. They are increasing the cost of basic local goods, but making it cheaper to import a car from overseas.
It's wild.
It's like putting a massive environmental tax on the city bus pass, but handing out discount coupons for private jets. How does that make sense?
I mean, from a purely environmental standpoint, making gas-powered vehicles cheaper while claiming to fight climate change is a complete contradiction.
Exactly.
But if we analyze the underlying mechanics of a regressive fiscal policy, a clear logic starts to emerge. We just have to look at who actually benefits from a tariff cut on imported vehicles.
Well, it's the importing class, right? It's wealthy consumers who actually have the capital to buy a new vehicle from abroad.
Exactly. The structural winners are indeed luxury consumers. And the losers are everyday citizens.
Because of the consumption tax.
Right. And the math on that is quite simple. Low and middle-income citizens spend a vastly higher percentage of their total income on daily consumption.
So it hits them way harder.
Exactly. If a household is wealthy, a 10% increase in the cost of basic manufactured goods barely registers against their overall wealth.
Right. They don't even notice it.
But if a household is living paycheck to paycheck, that same tax eats directly into their ability to survive. The financial burden of this climate policy is structurally placed on the shoulders of those who have the least capacity to absorb it.
Which brings up a huge question. If implementing a consumption tax on a struggling population is so unpopular and damaging, why would a government do it at all?
Right.
Like, why not just tax the wealthy? And that brings us to a massive shift in how the Nigerian government is funding itself.
This is where the data gets really interesting.
Yeah, the most striking data point in the entire Left Africa dossier is that domestic borrowing by the Nigerian government has increased by 241%.
That is just a staggering figure, nearly 2.5 times.
It's unbelievable.
And that data point is the key to the entire puzzle. The government is facing a severe revenue shortfall.
Okay.
Rather than raising progressive revenue, which would mean overhauling the tax system to target high net worth individuals and corporate profits, they've turned aggressively to domestic capital markets.
Wait, I need some help connecting the dots here. Nigeria is an oil-dependent economy, right? Oil accounts for about 90% of their foreign exchange earnings.
That's correct.
So if the government needs money for a green transition, why on earth wouldn't they just increase taxes on the multinational oil companies? Or heavily tax the ultra-wealthy individuals connected to that industry?
To understand that, we really have to look at the country's tax-to-GDP ratio.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It is a metric that measures how much of a country's economic output is captured by the government in taxes. In Nigeria, that ratio is currently hovering around 10.8%.
Wow, that seems incredibly low.
It is among the lowest in the world. For context, the average across OECD countries, the world's developed economies, is around 34%.
So Nigeria is barely collecting a third of that.
Right. They struggle with a massive informal economy that is very difficult to tax. But they also face a structural bind at the very top.
The oil companies.
Exactly. The government relies so heavily on those multinational oil majors for foreign exchange that any attempt to aggressively hike corporate taxes risks capital flight.
They just leave.
Yeah, the oil companies have the leverage to threaten divestment, basically packing up and moving operations to a country with a friendlier tax regime.
So the multinational corporations are effectively untouchable because the state desperately needs their foreign currency. What about the domestic elite?
Well, implementing a progressive wealth tax on the domestic elite creates severe political friction.
Because they're the ones in power.
Exactly. Wealthy individuals are deeply intertwined with the political apparatus. Overhauling the tax code to force the rich to pay their fair share requires immense political will.
Which they probably don't have.
Right. And frankly, it threatens the very patronage networks that often keep governments in power in the first place.
So instead of taking the politically difficult route of taxing the wealthy, the government takes the path of least resistance, borrowing.
Precisely.
But I want to dig into the mechanics of this 241% increase in domestic borrowing. How does a government practically borrow from its own elite?
So the government issues domestic bonds, or treasury bills, and domestic banks, institutional investors, and wealthy individuals buy these bonds.
Okay, so they're lending the government money.
Yes, it is incredibly fast and politically frictionless. The state gets an immediate injection of cash to fund its budget.
Sounds great for the government.
In the short term, yes. But domestic bonds in developing economies often come with very high interest rates. The government isn't just borrowing money. It is borrowing money at a steep premium.
Okay, I think I see the mechanism here. Let me try an analogy.
Go for it.
It's like paying off your high-interest credit card by borrowing a massive sum of money from your rich uncle.
Okay, tracking.
But to pay your rich uncle his guaranteed high-interest returns, you force your kids to empty their piggy banks every single week.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the macroeconomics at play here.
Wow.
The domestic debt stock balloons. And the cost to service that debt, meaning just paying the interest to those wealthy bondholders, starts to consume an enormous share of total government revenue.
And how do they generate the revenue to pay that interest? They implement a regressive green tax on everyday consumption.
Exactly.
They are quite literally borrowing from the rich at high interest and then using a consumption tax on the poor to pay the rich their returns.
It creates a closed loop of wealth transfer from the bottom of the economic ladder directly to the top.
That is incredibly dark.
And the genius, or perhaps the tragedy of it, is that this wealth transfer is packaged under the unassailable banner of climate alignment.
Yeah, you can't really argue against saving the planet.
Right.
But, understanding the macroeconomics of sovereign debt and bond deals is important, but we cannot evaluate a fiscal policy in a vacuum. We really have to look at the environment into which this tax is being introduced.
Absolutely. The human cost here is staggering when you consider the current economic reality.
Because context is everything.
It is. A minor consumption tax in a booming economy is an annoyance. In a fragile economy, it is devastating.
So let's set the scene of Nigeria right now, in 2026. The population is enduring a severe cost of living crisis.
Yes.
If we rewind a bit to May 2023, the government abruptly removed fuel subsidies.
A massive shock to the system.
Yeah, that single policy decision triggered a cascade effect across the entire economy. It instantly multiplied the cost of transport and logistics.
Right. And since then, the naira has been devalued twice. Inflation has been persistent and crushing, pushing the prices of basic food staples to multi-year highs.
So the average citizen's purchasing power has been systematically eroded over years.
Yeah.
And into this hyper-fragile environment, the government introduces a new tax that makes basic manufactured goods even more expensive.
It's just adding insult to injury.
But if we evaluate this as a climate policy, we also have to look at the emissions data. Who is actually responsible for the carbon footprint this tax is meant to address?
Well, the briefing notes that Nigeria's per capita carbon emissions are around 0.6 tons.
Which is incredibly low. To put 0.6 tons into perspective, the average per capita emissions in the United States is around 14 to 15 tons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that means a typical Nigerian's carbon footprint is roughly 1/40th of an American's.
1/40th.
Right. A market trader in Onitsha or a university student in Zaria has practically zero impact on global warming.
Yeah, they're barely registering. Yet, through this new consumption tax, they're being drafted to finance a response to a global climate crisis they did not create.
And the disconnect between the policy and the people is perfectly captured by this viral cultural moment mentioned in the briefing. Here's where it gets really interesting.
With the Google search trend?
Yes. Recently, search traffic for Remi Tinubu Akara spiked massively on Google in Nigeria.
Right.
For context, Remi Tinubu is the first lady of Nigeria, and Akara, they are fried bean cakes. They are a staple street food and serve as the absolute cheapest source of protein available to millions of low-income citizens.
Seeing those two search terms fused together is such a powerful indicator of the public mood.
It's the ultimate symbol of elite detachment. I mean, when the First Lady's name starts trending next to the ultimate survival food, it is the public collectively signaling a total breakdown in trust.
Yeah.
It's a population saying, we're meticulously tracking the price of a simple bean cake just to keep our families alive, and the political class has absolutely no idea what this struggle looks like.
It distills complex macroeconomic failures into a single visceral image.
It really does.
Because when a population firmly believes that its leadership is insulated from the economic pain of daily life, any new policy, no matter how it is branded, is viewed with intense suspicion.
Naturally.
Introducing a regressive consumption tax into an environment defined by relentless inflation and recent subsidy removals. While it means the policy isn't received as environmental stewardship, it is received as a punishment.
A punishment for a transition they can't afford, didn't cause, and won't benefit from.
Exactly.
But as we process how this paradox plays out on the ground in Nigeria, we need to zoom out a bit. Because the briefing from LeftAfrica doesn't treat this as an isolated incident of bad local governance.
No, they don't.
They argue this is actually a systemic feature of global climate policy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they introduce a framework called the green colonialism trap.
The green colonialism trap. Okay.
It is an essential concept for understanding how international climate targets impose structural burdens on developing economies.
Let's break down the mechanics of this trap. Because how does a global climate target set in, a conference room in Europe end up taxing a market trader in West Africa?
Well, the mechanism starts with Western-led international institutions. We're talking about the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the UNFCCC, which is essentially the United Nations' main climate agency.
Right.
These bodies establish universal climate frameworks. They set the global emission targets and determine the criteria for what constitutes a quote-unquote green economy.
And developing nations are heavily incentivized to adopt these frameworks.
They are structurally obligated to.
Obligated.
Yes. To access international legitimacy, sovereign debt relief, or crucial green finance packages, African governments must align with these Western-designed mandates.
Okay, that makes sense.
But international institutions don't just want promises. They demand structural economic adjustments. They require domestic tax reforms, the implementation of carbon pricing, and dedicated green revenues.
So they use a carrot and stick approach. The IMF might say, we will grant you this climate resilience loan, but you must demonstrate domestic revenue mobilization. You need a carbon tax.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. African governments agreed to these mandates to secure the funding, but then they bring these mandates back home and hit the exact domestic political wall we discussed earlier.
Elite.
Right. They cannot implement progressive taxes on their domestic elites or multinational corporations without risking capital flight or political collapse.
So they're squeezed between international pressure to raise green revenue and a domestic inability to tax the rich.
Precisely.
And the only valve left to release that pressure is taxing the poor.
The burden is pushed entirely onto the informal sector and low-income consumers. And the briefing demonstrates that this is a regional pattern, not just a Nigerian one.
Where else is this happening?
Look at Kenya. They introduced a carbon tax through their Finance Act, but the mechanism they used was simply applying a higher VAT, a value-added tax, which is essentially a sales tax on fuel and basic goods.
Oh, wow. which instantly spikes the cost of transport and food distribution for absolutely everyone.
Right. And South Africa offers another example. They are implementing a phased carbon tax on heavy industry, but the regulatory framework allows the cost to be passed directly through to consumers via higher electricity prices.
So the companies don't actually pay for it, the people do.
Exactly. And in Ghana, the government introduced a green levy on imports that ended up severely impacting small-scale cross-border traders in the informal economy.
It's the same story everywhere.
Across the continent. Because governments cannot structurally tax their elites, the financial weight of the global green transition is routinely shoved onto the lowest economic classes.
I want to push back on this framework for just a moment, just to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
Climate change is an existential planetary threat. We know that. And developing nations, particularly in Africa, are highly vulnerable to extreme weather, droughts, flooding. I mean, with stakes that high, isn't a flawed, poorly designed green tax still better than having no climate policy at all?
Yeah, that is the standard institutional defense.
Right. Don't governments have to start building these fiscal mechanisms somehow?
The argument is exactly that the urgency of the climate crisis overrides the need for perfect fiscal equity. But the counter-argument from our sources focuses on the core tenets of climate justice.
Yep.
If a climate policy structurally impoverishes a population, it is a failed policy.
It's a question of who actually bears the weight of the transition.
Yes. Consider the carbon footprint disparity again. The wealthiest 1% of a country generate a massive share of domestic emissions.
Through, frequent air travel and luxury consumption.
Exactly. Private jets, industrial ownership. If that 1% pays essentially nothing for the green transition, or, as we saw with the tariff cuts on imported cars, actually benefits from it, while the poorest 50% are forced to pay a regressive consumption tax on their daily survival.
Then the green label is rendered meaningless.
Completely. It simply becomes a disguise for an unjust transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich.
It stops being an environmental initiative and just becomes a mechanism of economic extraction. It forces the poor to subsidize a future they won't even be able to afford to live in.
A sustainable climate policy must be economically sustainable for the population. If it requires crushing the working class to meet an international benchmark, the policy itself is fundamentally broken.
Yeah, that is a really sobering perspective, and it fundamentally changes how we should consume news about global climate initiatives.
It really does.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, as you digest these complex economic realities? The next time you are scrolling through the news and you see a headline praising a developing nation for passing a progressive-sounding climate tax or a new green initiative, you now have the analytical tools to look past the shiny environmental marketing.
You have to move beyond the rhetoric.
Exactly. Instead of just applauding the green label, you should immediately ask the structural questions. You need to ask, who is actually footing the bill for this? Is this revenue being generated by progressive wealth taxes on heavy polluters, or is it being extracted by raising the cost of basic survival for the poorest citizens?
And we must demand that environmental sustainability does not become a Trojan horse for profound economic injustice.
Because crucially, while the government is publicly claiming environmental responsibility, you have to look at the fine print to see who is quietly getting a tariff cut on their luxury imports.
It's always in the fine print.
Always. And that leaves us with a final lingering question to mull over, one that builds directly on the friction we've uncovered today.
It's a big one.
If developing nations are structurally forced by the realities of massive domestic debt and international pressure to tax their most vulnerable citizens just to meet Western-designed climate targets, we have to wonder what the future of climate activism is actually going to look like on the ground. Will the next major global climate protests be fought by environmentalists holding signs demanding emission cuts? Or will they be fought by everyday citizens, pushed to the absolute brink, rioting over the cost of a simple bean cake?
Something to really think about.
We'll leave you to explore that thought on your own. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep looking past the headlines, and we'll catch you next time.